Acre Fund is a non-profit social enterprise. So why a social enterprise? Basically, we think like a business. So we run within our model also revenue-making units. And it means that for a fair share of our services, farmers are paying customers. This means they're also clients. So they have a demanding voice in the delivery of our services. Next year will be 20 years in existence, a milestone for the organization. And as you can see here on the map, we operate in East Africa, Nigeria, and very recently we started a pilot in the DRC. We focus on low-income farming families. These are typically women-led in remote rural areas in these countries. And we offer a complete solution for farm families to finance, distribute, and train them on life-improving technologies to drive prosperity and climate resilience. Now, we started our organization in 2006 in Western Kenya in a pilot with 40 farmers. We've now scaled to reach more than 5.5 million. And we reach farmers directly, which I will share in a bit more detail after the slide, but also partnerships working with government, private sector actors to build their resilience on different fronts. And every year we measure the impact that we have on farmers in terms of their livelihoods. We can ascertain that year on year out, farmers have a 35% annual profit boost on crops and products that we support, which increases their financial and climate resilience. So the core model that we deploy, and this is how the organization started out. Go to the next slide, Wafa. Is the core bundle or complete market bundle, as we call it. So allow me to explain how this works. Basically, we take life-improving technologies like improved seed, storage bags. It can also be solar lamps, cook stoves, farming equipment like wheelbarrows, really tailored to the context and to farmers' preferences. And we finance these inputs on credit. And we offer insurance to cushion farmers for risk. We ensure last mile delivery. We offer training throughout the season. And we facilitate markets for farmers for safe storage of their produce and making sure they get a fair price for their produce. Now, what we've learned over the years is that this model has to work in tandem. So all these components need to be delivered together, because a farmer may have the financing, but not have the right access to an affordable quality of inputs that are tailored to their soils or the climate. A farmer may have these inputs, but then lack the knowledge to plant or to weed or to compost correctly. And they're unfortunately set up for failure. So this is really the key part of the solution that we drive. So let me show you in the next slide what it looks like in practice. So what we do is we have a field force of field officers in the communities where we operate, often farmers themselves. They're from the communities, they know the farmers, and they enroll farmers in groups of 8 to 12. These groups, along a microfinance principle that's widely known, take a loan together. But it's not just taking a loan together, they trade together, they exchange ideas together. So it really builds social capital. And then with the farmer's needs and the order that they place with us, we purchase them. This picture here shows a typical warehouse that we run across countries, which allow us to procure inputs in bulk and on time ahead of the planting season. And this is crucial because farmers need to plant their seeds on time. And we make sure that these are accessible and easy to get for farmers, so often within walking distance to their homes. And then throughout the season, through our field officers, in group trainings, like you see here on the picture, we offer trainings. These are practical, hands-on trainings, not rocket science, as simple as possible. And then farmers throughout the season, they will repay us through flexible loan repayment terms. Year on year out, we're about 96% repayment. This is the One Acre Fund. It's a fund for 1 acre farmers, basically. And this is what we are driving to increase prosperity and climate resilience. Now, on top of this, we also have other channels like tree planting, market access, but this is the essence of our work. So let me just pause here. I think we have a quick poll for the audience. And the question we want to ask you all is: improving resilience important in your work?
We'll give it a minute till people respond to the poll. Okay, I'll share the results now.
And the prize for the brave one who said no, yes.
But great. Should be very helpful then.
All right, good. Then it's good that we're having this webinar. Otherwise, we can all close shop and go home. All right, so allow me, on behalf of One Acre Fund, to explain how we vision climate resilience. So for us, we look at it in four pillars: plant health, soil health, income diversification, and safety nets. Starting out with plant health, it's critical that farmers have access to the right seed varieties that are tailored to their agricultural zones. We want to make sure that farmers reduce fertilizer rates. We practice microdosing, only what's really necessary. Pest management is also key, and we offer real-time guidance, advisory services on when to plant. This is critical. But even more is the soil health. I mean, this is critical for future generations. So how can we strengthen soil health? By composting, erosion control, agricultural lime to address acidity, but also looking at crop rotation, and then green manure cover crops to bring back biomass to the soils. And we've learned that farmers should not rely only on one crop. It cannot be only maize or beans, staple crop, but we need to offer a variety. So that's why we're offering agroforestry, trees, timber trees, fruit trees, different kinds, but also poultry, intercropping with beans and maize are, for instance, very good crops to intercrop, but also looking at other commercial crops where applicable, be it coffee, chili, soya, avocado, it really depends. And then lastly, it's safety nets, because what we're seeing with climate change is that farmers are facing increased stresses and risks. So we offer crop insurance that protect farmers against weather and disease. But we also offer long-term asset growth, especially our tree program is catered to that. In case of shocks, and if need be, farmers have a living savings account on their land they can access if they need to. So it's all these four that we put into place. Yeah, next slide, Wafa. But I mean, this is a great vision, but we need to measure this. So this is for One Acre Fund key, and impact is our North Star. We serve smallholder farmers, and everything we do, we place them first. But to do that, we need to measure more things than only big harvests or income increase. We have to look also at the quality of life. So things like food security, empowerment, but also on soils, organic materials that are being put back in, what have you. So all these three pillars are something that are guiding our climate resilience strategy and that we measure year in, year out. Next slide, Wafa. And so why is it important? Because it prioritizes farmers' needs. So what is it that we focus on? What is it that they are demanding? And what is it tailored to the solutions that they need? It allows us to drive continuous improvement. If something doesn't work, we'll downscale, we won't do it. If it does work, we'll scale it. Everything to increase yields and productivity. And at the end of the day, we want to be accountable for what we're delivering. We want to make sure that the results are there, visible for farmers and the other stakeholders that we work with. So we want to make sure that our results are accessible for others to see. Let me pause here and then hand it off to the MEL team. Thank you.
Shall I launch in, Yaniv, or do you have some
No, no,
questions?
I'll just hand it over to you in a bit. But I think it was quite interesting that most of the people said that resilience is quite important in their work. I'm actually curious to hear from everyone if they could just leave it in the chat about, even though it's important for you to look at resilience or improve resilience, how do you define resilience in your work? I think that that's quite an interesting thing because one thing is defining it, the other thing is how do you measure it? But let's start there. Like, how have in your programming or in your work, how do you define resilience? I think we're curious to hear from that too. And so we hear sustaining the intervention and ensuring that it lasts longer than a project from an intervention standpoint. Yes. That's more around sustainability. Yep. So we're seeing when communities refuse to give up even when harvests are not as bountiful as predicted. So holding on to practices, enabling capacity to prepare, respond, recover to changes in the context, right? And resistance to shock. Great. So we're seeing definitions come through. I think this would be quite interesting when we get into how do we measure for this and how do we bring it all together. So Phil, I can hand it over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Munir. So hi everybody. Yeah, my name is Phil Leonard. I'm the global director for MEL for One Acre Fund. I've been with One Acre Fund for about a year and a half, and coming from a background of M&E in various contexts, including most recently in a private consulting company here in Uganda, but before that in Canadian government, which is where I'm from. So yeah, let me get into what we measure. So I think you've already seen sort of in some of the other slides, these broad brackets, but I would say that top left, so farm profits and assets. So what do we measure? Big harvests and dollar impact. That's been our sort of traditional bread and butter of what do we measure. Are we actually making a difference in the income and over time in the asset buildup of our farmers? So that's, yeah, we've always done that. That is sort of the core element of what we measure. Household wealth being a part of that. And then the others, I mean, to some extent, we've always measured them, but we've been getting more and more serious about these ones more recently as well. So particularly, so healthy families, that's where we're starting to think about sort of these resilience indicators. So food security, there's an index called the FIES that we measure. There's nutrition indices that we measure in terms of getting the right mix of foods. We more recently, and Wafa, who's on the call, is our expert here, have been really expanding our measures of gender and youth empowerment. And I think Eve's going to talk about our gender expansion as well. But just to say, just like for me, it's really fascinating because I come from a world of individuals, and so they're male or female is very clear. In our case, we're mostly helping farming households, right? So we go and give the training at a household level, and so traditionally we haven't really thought about like, okay, what's it mean to be a female-headed household or a male-headed household or joint. But more recently, yeah, our funders want to know, they want to see evidence that we're, at least helping females as much as we are males. And so we've done a lot in terms of measuring sort of like, yeah, what do we mean by that? Do we mean the person who owns the land and therefore is the farm leader? Do we mean the person who signed the contract with us? Do we mean the person who actually plants the fields, makes a decision about planting? All of those are incorporated in some of our gender indices. Also, of course, youth, and same sort of question applies. In most of our countries, you don't find very many youth who actually own the farm, right? So even if it's just an acre, in most cases, it's somebody, an adult, but the house may well have multiple children who are working, or youth, sorry, not necessarily, not children, multiple youth who are working on the farm, involved in the planting, harvest, etc. And then, yeah, rich soils. Tim already mentioned a bit of diversity of income. So we measure both income diversity as well as agrobiodiversity. So basically the number of different crops and their percentages on the field make up an index. And soil health, yeah, we're looking at some of the indicators around the health of the soil. Next slide, please, Wafa. So I think key thing for our overall, like, how do we do it? The two main things that we're looking at. So number one, everything that we talk about whenever we talk about our income is always a 1 acre fund farmer compared to a non 1 acre fund farmer. So we've always got a control group. We try our best to make that control group really rigorous. Now, for those of you who are male practitioners, you will note there is still a self-selection issue. People opt into our programming, and those who don't opt in are the ones who we have to choose from as a control group. So I'm going to get into some of our propensity score matching techniques that we use to try and correct for that. And also, I'm going to talk about the fact that's part of the reason why we sometimes do randomized control trials to try and deal with those things. But for our annual measurements, our ongoing measurements, we have control groups of neighbors of our actual farmers. So actually, as we survey our farmers, we ask them, can you give us the names of 3 to 5 of your neighbors who have similar types of farms to you, but who aren't working with 1 Acre Fund? They give us the names and we go and survey them as well. And as I said, so the main thing that we're measuring is farm profits overall, so revenues minus costs. In most cases, our farmers are going to have both more revenues as well as more costs, exactly because we're providing them inputs, and so they tend to use more of the inputs than the control farmers. So they actually have both more revenues and more costs. And of course, what we want to see is that the profit is therefore also increased. So revenue, one would hope, would increase more than the costs have increased. But our attempt is to really survey them on all of those costs, including labor, transportation, all of the inputs that go into it. One thing that we do, I've been talking about surveys, so asking them questions, but we also do physical crop harvests. So we have what we call a harvest box, which is usually a 6x6 square randomly placed on the field. And then we literally harvest every piece. Usually, if we're talking about maize, which is our core crop, we harvest every piece of maize in that box and compare it treatment group versus control group. So on your 6x6 square, how much maize came off treatment versus control. And then we also adjust for land size differences. There's a couple things around land size. So what we do find is because it's usually more profitable, our farmers end up over time farming more land, either because they rented more land or because they had land that was sitting fallow before, which they decided now it's profitable to plant more of that field. So over time, they tend to have more land that is being farmed. But we want to separate that from any pre-existing differences. So if our control group isn't a perfect control group, what you can find is that they have smaller land size to begin with. So the key element is we're trying to control for that, to say which part of this increased land size is actually because we've seen the growth of them deciding to increase the land size versus they just started as being larger landowners. Next slide, please, Wafa. So I briefly mentioned the propensity score matching at the start. So as I said, we've still got an issue. We've got a treatment group and a control group. We've tried our best to get their neighbors who should be pretty similar to them, but nevertheless, you can imagine that there are still some differences across the two groups. So possibly our 1 Acre Fund group. A common one is they might have higher incomes even prior to joining the 1 Acre Fund. So we want to control for all of those differences. We use propensity score matching to match each 1 Acre Fund client to the best match of a non-1 Acre Fund client using the propensity score match. And so then, anything that you see, like in our reports, everything that's saying, okay, One Acre Fund farmers, you earned $100 more on average than non-One Acre Fund farmers. That's all based on propensity score matched results. I just mentioned the land size equalization, how there's sort of two factors at play. Ideally, the propensity score matching and some difference in difference. So seeing people over time to see that growth in the land size of their planting is one of the things that we try to be careful about. And then spillover effects. So the other, I guess, it's a good thing overall that our techniques are spilling over, right? So if we go and we help 100 farmers and then they tell their friends about our techniques and they say, oh, it's best to plant the maize this far apart and it's best to use just a small amount of fertilizer, the exact right amount that you need. That's a good thing overall, right? We want people to benefit from this. But from the mill perspective, it does make complication for how we measure the actual the actual impact, because if we're actually bringing up our control group as well as our treatment group, then the measured impact gets smaller. And so we do try and do some statistical adjustments, and we ask as well as the most simple thing that we do is also we just ask the control farmers, do you know about these techniques? Did you observe your neighbor doing this? Did you hear about it from them? Those sorts of things to try and get a sense of to what extent are our techniques spilling over from our actual treatment farmers to the non-One Acre Fund farmers. Next slide, please, Wafa. So this is just kind of an example of the data that we collect, and it's a hypothetical example. So the 3,000 surveys there, that's a number pulled out of the air, but at the same time, it's not completely crazy. Like in some of the surveys, we do have numbers that high. It might be 1,500 treatment and 1,500 control, for example. And we base that always on a power calculation. So we use our historical data to know the average in the past for the treatment group in terms of their yields and in terms of the standard deviation of their yields. And the same for the control group, we know over historically. And so we do a power calculation to say, okay, how many surveys are we going to need to observe statistically significant results this year? So each year we update those numbers and survey based on those power calculations. And of course, you add in a buffer to account for the fact that for your non-response and people opting out over time or these kinds of things. But yeah, so we collect surveys for both the treatment and control. We end up with examples of this kind of data, which we have typically used Stata internally, although we are switching a little bit more to R now. But collecting data in this kinds of coming from the survey into the Stata data set, and so each row represents a farmer with various information about them, including. So typically we do the first survey 1 month after planting. So we ask them, what did you plant? How much inputs did you use? Did you use fertilizer? How far apart did you plant if it's maize, how far apart was the maize? What else do you have on the field? Is it intercropped with beans, for example, which is a common one in Rwanda? And then the follow-up is in order to capture revenue. So during the harvest, we go and we ask them about, what are they harvesting and how much of it. But also, as I mentioned, our main indicator for yields is that harvest box. So we harvest a random selection of the field ourselves in order to get that measure of the yield differences. Yeah, I think that's the gist of this slide. We clean up the data using Stata, and then we report it as transparently as we can, and we have annual public reports on our impact. Next slide, please, Rafa.
Philip, before you go into the next one, I think there are some questions coming in which I thought would be sort of relevant to this one. I think the first one is really about the sampling. Like, how did you get into the sampling? How did you decide on it? I know you mentioned statistical significance, but then I think the question is, how do you decide sampling for the control group about specific of the treatment group as well? And then how do you check for causality and see like that is reflected in your analysis? If you could just expand on that a little bit more, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the sampling, our annual reporting is done. We'll take a random sample of all the farmers who are in our program database. So of course, on the Tim talked mostly about our credit program. So they receive the inputs on credit at the start, and then they pay back. And so of course, in order to do that, they register with us. So we get their name and their phone number and where they live. And so that's just a pure random sample. It might be stratified. So, okay, we'll say we're going to get 50 from each of these 100 villages or whatever, so it's stratified across the villages or districts, depending on the geography of the country in question. And then, like I mentioned, so where the control group is sampled from is literally, we've asked these farmers, who are your neighbors? And so we take that list as well. We write down the list with their phone number, and we randomly select from that full list of the control farmers. So that's all done. Again, that random selection is all done in Stata to come up with the sampling frame, the sampling lists. And then the question on causality, yeah. So we try our best with the propensity score matching to control for the factors that we can. So the key thing with propensity score matching is you can believe in its causality if you believe that all the variables that you've controlled for in the propensity score match actually are the ones that drove program participation. So if we've covered everything in there that actually drove the program participation, then we should have an actual causal estimate. Now, you can still think about things that we aren't able to capture. So the typical example is like motivation, for example, and we might not have a good measure of motivation. So suppose more motivated farmers are more likely to sign up with us, and maybe more motivated farmers would have had higher yields anyways. If that's the case, so if we're missing a motivation variable, then we would have a biased estimate in our propensity score matched result. That is one of the big reasons why we still do periodic randomized control trials, which I think is in my next slide or the slide after. So yeah, that's we find it like it's just too much to try to do. I mean, it's literally not possible to do randomized control trials every year for annual reports. It's too expensive. It's too hard to keep. I mean, it means you have to keep a group who's always a control group, but that's been randomly selected. So they would like the programming, but you're telling them, no, you can't have it. So we have to use the RCTs a little bit sparingly. Yeah, how's that? I mean, does that, yeah, okay, great. So then I think we can move on. Yeah. So yeah, thanks, Wafa. The basics of what we're doing, as I said, it's really just a comparison of the two. So if Group A is our average 1 acre fund farmer, and we go and survey them, and on average their revenues are $300, and they have costs of $200, they therefore profited $100. Meanwhile, we go and ask their neighbors, who are the non-1 acre fund farmers, for their revenues and costs. And in this hypothetical example, it's $150 and $100 of costs. And so in this illustrative example, the 1 acre fund farmers are profiting $50 more. So we would say in this example that we've impacted our farmers by $50 on average. Their profit has increased compared to the non-1 acre fund farmers, but by that $50. That's the basic of what we're doing. And all of these numbers would be propensity. You can think of these as like propensity score matched averages, right? Like of the group that has good matched individuals. Next slide, please, Wafa. Yeah, so some of the other things, I've just talked about sort of the bread and butter, which is profit, but obviously we're using other indicators as well, which So the United Nations Food Insecurity Experience Scale, that basically is a series of questions on, have you missed a meal in the last, I forget the time periods. Have you missed a meal in the last week? Have you missed a meal in the last few months, etc.? Have you had to eat fewer meals during the day than you would have opted to because of financial challenges? Questions like that indicate food insecurity. So we use that index. It's a pretty standard index to get a sense of how our farmers are doing compared to the control group. I mentioned earlier the Women's Empowerment Index as well. So that's one that was developed by IFPRI. And basically, it's about women's empowerment and their inclusion in the agricultural sector. So there's a series of questions, like I mentioned earlier. Do you own the land? Do you work the land? Do you have input into the decisions of what is planted, when to harvest, etc.? So a series of questions. And again, Wafa is our expert on this one, but really fascinating stuff when you actually look at those questions asked to men compared to those questions asked to women, and the differences in the two. A lot of times, really neat patterns can come out. And so, ultimately, we're trying to assess: is this household sort of, headed is a term I don't really like either, but who's ultimately making the decisions about this farm, and can we classify that into mostly the male, mostly the female, or sort of really pretty joint? Yeah, next slide, please, Wafa. And yeah, as I mentioned, we also, exactly for the reason because we're close with the propensity score match, but you can't ever get truly at a causal result without, random assignment. So we do periodic RCT experiments. Obviously, it's easiest to do an RCT in the country where you're rolling out, so you haven't already saturated the whole market, in which case you can find control groups who have never had any experience with One Acre Fund. We currently have about, I think, 3 RCTs ongoing. One of them's in Rwanda, looking at our tree program. One of them is in Uganda, looking at our coffee program, and one's in Malawi, looking at insurance. So those 3 are going on. But as I mentioned, for those of you who are male practitioners, that like the costs of an RCT are very, very high. If we did everything RCT, we would have no money left for running our programming. And so it's always going to be a trade-off, right? Like you could have the highest, absolutely most robust possible measures on everything, but you'd leave yourself with very little money to actually run your programming. At the other extreme, you can spend all your money on programming and never know if it actually works. So we're trying to find that right balance. I think we err on the side of, I would like to say that compared to most NGOs of our, like, we're erring on the side of robust measures. But yeah, so anyways, yeah, RCTs, we do them somewhat sparingly, but targeted to where we think we need good answers, particularly, obviously with new program, either new programs or new program components. You might want to do the full RCT to really understand, is this working the way we think it is? Yeah. I think, is that my last slide, Wafa? I think so. Oh, sorry, no, I'm not. Yeah, so the tree program, so that is actually, so the tree program is essentially, we're giving away now seedlings of various type. A lot of them are agroforestry, so like trees that are for wood. So there's a lot of those. There's also a lot of fruit trees. Regardless, this has been a challenge for our measurement because, of course, if you give somebody a seedling, regardless of its type, it doesn't add anything to their profit on their farm this year or next year or even the year after. The vast majority of trees take anywhere from 5 to 7 years before, in the case of a fruit tree, before they start bearing fruit. In the case of a tree for wood, it's going to take that long to grow large enough to be worth cutting for wood. So what we've done with our tree program is we've used a net present value approach where we estimate the value of the tree over its lifetime. So we assume that to be 20 years for the trees. We take into account the likelihood that it actually survives. So we do a planting survey to see how many trees have gotten planted, and a follow-up survival survey to see how many trees are still alive. We also do surveys on the uses of these trees. So if you're cutting them for firewood, we try to value the firewood, get a sense of how much firewood you would get annually from a tree, and put that in a net present value approach to say, okay, what should that be worth now? And again, it's quite interesting. Like quite a range in terms of the tree values, from as little as like $4 or $5 for some of them on the very low end, to some that are up at like a couple of $100 where they're high value fruit trees, for example. Yeah, and so they're basically the key thing that we're doing in terms of the actual MEL measurement. So we're comparing, again, we get the treatment farmers from the ones who actually come and pick up our trees. So same sort of self-selection issue there. We get the control farmers from people who don't. We still compare, so control farmers, we check and see, did you plant any trees yourself? Sourced from wherever else they may have got it. And so that's why that picture there shows, I think, 9 trees versus 2 trees. So we would say in this case, you had 7 incremental trees. And then we say, okay, our programming based on our measurements has increased the number of trees this many, and we value them. And so that's how we come to the estimate of how much value our tree program has had. Yeah, I think that must be my stopping point, right, Wafa? Yeah. So I will pause there. Munib, go ahead, and Eve comes after me.
Yes, thank you, Philip. I think there have been quite a few questions pouring in, so I'm actually still going to direct a few. So it's not just for Philip, I think for the whole One Acre Fund family here. I would start with, I think it was interesting when you mentioned that you do use randomized control trials to assess causality or to get a better understanding of it. And you mentioned that you also have your propensity score mapping just for that comparison. So it's interesting. I would be curious to know that let's say when you compare results that you get from your propensity score matching as compared to RCTs, are they close to each other? Because to what we understand, RCTs are quite expensive. Now, in case programs cannot go for it, we want to understand like the alternative that you use. How close is it in terms of the results? Have you done sort of a comparison there?
Yeah, we've absolutely done those comparisons. Usually the results are quite close, and if anything, usually the RCT results are slightly higher, although that's usually because they're in areas where we're new to, right? So there's not like it's our impacts are somewhat greater in areas where we've just arrived, where nobody knows this stuff. Whereas if you were to do, I mean, it's hard or impossible to do an RCT in an area where you've already fully rolled out. But if you were able to do it, you'd probably find lower results in those areas, because even the people who aren't in your programming have some experience or know about this. So yeah, like particularly Rhonda, for example, a lot of our surveys now, I mentioned sort of that spillover issue, but also now we have this issue of like somebody who's a control farmer because they didn't participate this year or last year, but they may have still participated now 3 or 4 years ago. So we try our best, yeah, to not exclude everybody, but I think usually we say, okay, in the last 3 years, we're not going to, if you've not participated in the last 3 years, we can count you in our control group.
Right. Okay, that's another question, because I think you mentioned that some of the work that you do, you want to get insights to make adjustments. So could you give me some examples of, because the process that you're explaining here, I think sounds quite rigorous, like you mentioned. So I think with rigor comes time to follow that rigorous process. So are you able to get insights early enough to make adjustments? And if you could just give me some examples of those.
Yeah, so I think big one for us is sort of annually we update what we call our yield drivers. So we do an analysis of like what actually, so farmer A has, this much yield and used, we have a lot of knowledge around their like how much inputs did they use, what happened over the year, was there a drought, was there flooding, was there this and that. And so we do, like, every year we also do an analysis for each country of like what drove the yield for that country's population of farmers for that year. And we really report back to that in terms of, especially on the best practices, for example. So if we've taught everybody, here's the proper spacing for maize, and they're doing it, then of course we report back to the country program about that. But if they're not doing it, especially, right, that's where we really see it, the adjustments. So if we see, oh, the application of lime is really lagging in this country, we'll let them know, and they say, oh, they want, I mean, obviously everybody wants to increase their impact, but at One Acre Fund, like, it's the most I've like, people are really, really driven about the impact numbers because like, they're actually being, the country directors are actually being judged a little bit on like how well is your country performing, and that's based on the actual impact numbers for your country. So yeah, we definitely, there's a lot of sort of feedback with the country program team. Eve's going to talk about how our team is laid out, but each country has its own MEL team who are really embedded within the program of that country.
Right. A few more questions before we move to Eve. I think one is around the idea that One Acre Fund has been in the space for quite a few number of years now. And let's say when you are measuring from a profitability perspective about how much farmers make year on year, have you invested in a longitudinal study of sorts, or just to see the progress of how farmers have used that increased income over time into more, let's say, profitable activities or building their resilience? And that can be on non-farm activities as well, as, running a small business, which might not be small farm related, or maybe going into other crops. So have you done any assessment there, especially in areas where you've been active for quite a while now?
Definitely, yes. So in terms of the longitudinal, we had one in just recently in Rwanda where we followed the same farmers over 3 years. We called that our holistic survey, because we were trying to be holistic in terms of all the different programming they were taking. So we're a bit, not, I don't want to say siloed, but we do like each program. So there's our credit program, our cash program where people just buy the inputs directly in our trees. And so they tend, like, a tiny bit siloed where they all do their own thing and do their evaluations of their own programming. But this, what we call the holistic survey, was attempting to get at, like, we'll do a random walk and collect information from random farmers in the village, and just ask them, what programs have you participated in over the last couple of years? And then we tracked them over 3 years just to see, yeah, that moving in and out of our programming across the different streams of our programming, but also then to see over time. And in fact, Wafa and one of our colleagues is working on a study right now to use that data that we collected over the last few years to look at exactly the second question you asked, which is, can you see people move over time from sort of, very low income to less low income over the course of their experience with One Acre Fund. So yeah, that one, I would say, is a bit still in its development. We have a bit of information on that. You can see, like, our experienced farmers do better than our less experienced, but most of our data is sort of annual, repeated cross sections of data rather than longitudinal following the same farmers over time. So yeah, I think it's definitely an area where we also want to continue to build.
Right. Great. I think another question, which is, I think when you mentioned RCTs and expense, I think there were some questions triggered there, like how do you make that decision? So I think like you mentioned, like in your propensity score matching, the results are quite similar, but with RCT, especially when you do it in new areas, you get maybe higher differences there. So, and it's expensive. So, how do you make that trade-off between which package of measurement to apply to a particular kind of program or intervention or country? And I think as a follow-up to that is, um, let's say if you go with option package A, which is RCT plus propensity, package B, which is just propensity score matching, what percentage of your, let's say, budget in programming as a percentage estimate would go into these measurement activities?
Sure. So one thing, so our standard measures, so that includes the propensity score matching. We do that every year for every program. So there's not really a trade-off in that sense there, that they're always there. The question is, yeah, do we also do an RCT? And I think there's a couple elements to it. So one, we do actually, and Tim can talk about it from the biz dev perspective maybe a little bit, but we actively seek out funders for those RCTs. So the three that I mentioned, there's actual individual funders who are funding like those specific RCTs because they are quite expensive, right? Like in the order of, an even mid-size RCT can be in the order of $1 million, right? So they're big things. So typically, that wouldn't come from our sort of core annual budget. That would come from some sort of, because we identify that there's a project that needs to happen. We need to understand this through an RCT, and we've got usually a separate funding for a specific RCT. But Tim, maybe you want to add on to that if I've got that perfectly right.
That's about right, Philip. I think so. Without the RCTs, I think we spend around 3 million per year on our M&E system, give or take. And then I just want to add as well that RCTs as well. I mean, there's also an ethical element also to consider because you're keeping farmers out of your program deliberately for can be several years, right? So that's something as One Acre Fund we want to of course impact as many farmers as we can. So there's a lot of trade-offs to make, as Philip already of course shared, but that's also one that we take into consideration.
Right. And just to flag, Tim, when you say 3 million, that's across your portfolio, like all your measurement, right?
Yeah, yeah. Give or take. It's not the exact figure.
Right, of course. Yeah. I think some sort of implementation questions. So when you talk about, I think there was a question coming in when you said like when you offer inputs to farmers or credit to farmers, do you also look into other things like they say like small farmers often lack um, training and access to personal protective equipments, and that might also have a difference in how their productivity looks like or their motivations on how they perform on farm. So, do you also look into these other factors, other services that small farmers might need? I mean, there can be other NGOs working in that space as well. So, that again might be from a measurement perspective, that might be how do you compare them? Or do you have farmers who have access to these and then not having access to these? Or does One Acre Fund actually work in offering these services as well?
Yeah, we do. So the programming itself, I think there were six pictures that Tim had at one point, but part of it is the training. So when they enroll, they get access to the inputs on credit. They get trained in how to use those inputs, and that includes personal protective equipment. If there is in fact pesticide, we try to really limit the amount of pesticide that people are using, but still sometimes people have a need. So we would definitely train them on personal protective equipment. And we also ask questions in our surveys. Yeah, do you use PPE? How did you apply this stuff? So we do track that as well.
Okay, great. And I think another one from a perspective of your programming and delivery, there's a question when you say like when you mention impact, and I think when Tim started off, he was talking about impact also from a business development perspective about how the business performs, whereas when Philip were really specifically talking about impact at a farm level. So within One Acre Fund as a whole, is impact really differentiated based on the types of interventions, or do you always look at impact at a business level as well as at the farm level across the board?
I think Eve is covering that a little bit in terms of how we measure what we call social return on investment. So yeah, when we aggregate things, definitely there's a like we try to dollarize things because it's hard to compare number of trees versus kilograms of maize, for example. So yeah, at the end of the day, most of it is we try to monetize it and say, okay, it's this many dollars. But yeah, in terms of like the business end of it, Eve's going to talk about how we measure what we call social return on investment.
Okay, great. So I think with that, I will move on to Eve, who's been waiting patiently for a while now. So please, if you could just take it away.
Thank you so much, Munib. So my name is Evelyn, and I am the Deputy Director of Global Mal at One Acre Fund. I've actually been with One Acre Fund for about 8 years, starting as the Kenya lead, and have grown progressively over the years. I'll be walking you through our reporting and also speaking a little bit about our data collection infrastructure. So a big part of our rigor at One Acre Fund really comes from how we handle data, and that really speaks to our data collection process, but also the data quality management processes that we have in place. As Phil has mentioned, every year we run annual impact assessments across each of our markets using standardized survey protocols, of course, adapted for the market. And, we have our enumerators go through an entire training process. We rely on digital data collection methods. Predominantly, we use Comcare. And then on top of that, during the data collection process, we have these sort of data quality minimum must-dos that range from high frequency data checks that we conduct, as well as in real time back checks, where there's a group of enumerators who either back checkers who go into the field and speak to the farmers that have been surveyed, or who make phone calls to really confirm that our enumerators are coding the correct responses that farmers have shared, our respondents have shared. And so all of this really ensures, or it gives us the confidence that the data that we're collecting and consequently reporting on is truly reflective of our farmers' lived realities and that our impact is accurate. Moving on to the next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So let's quickly speak about how we learn, improve, and adapt our measurement approaches. First, we are really working to expand our measurement beyond a single crop. In some of our markets, impact models were very much centered on maize, which is a staple crop, across most of our markets. But of course, we know that farmers grow a diverse, they have a diverse crop portfolio. And so it's really critical that we are capturing whole field, whole farm profitability. And so over the last year, we've been piloting a whole farm measurement approach, and that is now scaling across all of our markets going into 2026. Secondly, we continuously work to improve our methodologies. And what does that mean? That means that at least annually, we conduct reviews, and that can be either internally through working groups, and sometimes we bring in external researchers. We recently brought in IPA to conduct a thorough, comprehensive reviews of our study designs, our measurement frameworks, and they identify areas that require improvement, and we work to really institute those changes. Thirdly, we adapt our methods to meet specific contexts and needs. We work across 7 markets, and so not all countries are the same. Their needs in terms of data and insights can also vary quite radically. And so we really aim to, develop MEL systems that are right-sized for each market to ensure that we are delivering as per the needs of that leadership team. We also work with different partners, so Gates, DGIS, and those partners sometimes have data collection needs that are incremental, let's say, compared to what we typically collect. And so again, we work with each country MEL team to ensure that we're incorporating those data requirements into what we collect and also how we report. So really the goal here is to be hyper flexible and adaptable to each market in terms of, again, leadership data needs, but also for our partners so that we're also meeting those business development objectives. Moving on to the next slide. So thinking about our MEL structure at One Acre Fund, moving on to the next slide. So thinking about our MEL structure within One Acre Fund, there are 3 tiers, I would say, and we all work in a very, I would say, harmonious way. And I really like that about working at One Acre Fund. So we have the global team, and it's a smaller team, and that consists of what I would call the global managers. And our role is to provide oversight across all the MEL departments within each country. So oversight support. We're like, we engage in professional development of all the country leads, and we ensure that learnings are being shared across our different markets, as well as, of course, holding the countries to a particular data quality standard as it relates to collection, but also reporting, analysis and reporting. Then at the country level, each country has its own inbuilt MEL team, and that is layered with enumerators, supervisors, back checkers, data coordinators, analysts, and so forth. The size is very much dependent on the size of the country, the number of channels, or basically the number of surveys that need to be conducted. And then finally, we have our external experts. Phil spoke about how we've worked with Laterite and other consultancies, and they come in to provide support, whether that's sort of like conducting our RCTs to sort of validate or help us triangulate our internal studies, or if we have new channels and we potentially don't have the capacity to handle that work internally, we really leverage external experts to close that gap. Moving on to the next slide, which is how we report on our impact. So at One Acre Fund, we often say that impact is our North Star, and that's not just financial impact. We also care deeply about our clients' well-being and really think about both their financial and their non-financial outcomes. And our reporting ensures that we are considering both aspects, and I'll dig into them in later slides. And so each country will develop their own sort of in-country reports. And what I'll walk you through are the global reports. So each country develop reports that are very country specific, and then some certain metrics are pulled up into these sort of like cross-country reports that allow us to understand each country's performance in comparison to each other, both in terms of financial metrics, but also non-financial metrics. So starting with the financial metrics, SRI. So whenever you hear about One Acre Fund, we oftentimes speak about SRI. And this really is the foundation of our model at One Acre Fund, and it sits at the center of how we define success. We want to be confident that the farmers who we serve are seeing meaningful financial gains from engaging with our programs. And so what does that entail? You'll see in the SRR calculation at the top, we have impact. So this is total impact across all of our programming divided by the donor investment. So how much we have invested in this programming. And so this metric plays a big role in shaping decisions from how we allocate funding between channels or programs within a country, but also across countries. So financing or resourcing at One Acre Fund is oftentimes channeled towards programs and countries that are high SRI, so they're deemed to be very impactful for our farmers, or that we believe are going to be very impactful in the future. So we consider both current and also future SRI. So I think most organizations within our sector don't necessarily engage with the concept of SRI. I think it's something that One Acre Fund instituted because, like I said, impact is our North Star. But I think it's something that could be leveraged within any organization. Just really thinking about, given the investments potentially that you are receiving from partners, how much impact are you generating for your clients? And it's a really powerful metric to share with current and prospective partners, because it really speaks to the efficiency of their investment. Moving on to the next slide. So this first report is, we're sharing this from our core channel. We have 4 channels. We offer credit on, we offer inputs on credit, core, via cash. So that's a different channel with its own reporting, agroforestry, and also market access, which is our new channel. But I wanted to share the core model, and you'll see here, there's only a snapshot for Kenya, but every country has their sort of impact is pulled into this dashboard, and it captures both their farmer impact. So this is direct impact on our clients, and also indirect impact, which is our spillover impact on non-One Acre Fund clients. As it relates to spillover impact in some of our more mature countries, so that would be Kenya and Rwanda, where, as Phil has mentioned, the major, as we look for comparison farmers in certain areas, we realize that everyone within a community has been reached by One Acre Fund in one way or another. And so, there are these sort of spillover effects through trainings, even though they're not receiving our inputs. And so it's really important that we also capture those sort of indirect effects. We do this in a really robust way. The years where this is not detected, and so we don't claim on it. But in the years that it is included in our total impact calculation. Moving on to the next. Oh, I know there's a lot of metrics on this, so I don't know if there are any questions where we can speak about that at the end, at the tail end. The next report is our demographics report. And so again, for every channel, it is really critical that we have a firm understanding of who our clients are, who our farmers are, what their profile is in terms of demographics, i.e. gender, age, household size, land holding, but also in terms of, for example, we spoke about, on-farm and off-farm income. We also want to understand whether they're generating a substantial percentage of their income from agriculture versus not, as well as their assets and so forth. And so this information really has helped us programmatically to really understand that even though we work in the rural economy, there are a number of different farmer segments within the rural economy. And it was this sort of insight that led to One Acre Fund, especially in the bigger markets, so the Kenyas, Rwanda, and Malawis, really building out these other channels, for example, cash. We realized that we were serving, I would say, maybe with a core channel, we were serving a segment of the rural population that are particularly underserved. And then that there was a segment that are relatively well-to-do, i.e. have cash to purchase inputs without the support of credit. And so it's really critical also within your own programming to think about, do you have your beneficiaries? Are there different segments? And what can you do in terms of programming, tweaking your programming to serve the needs of each segment? Moving on to the next slide. I spoke about how we care about both financial and non-financial impact. We really recognize that the financial metric doesn't provide a full picture of our farmers and their lives. And so this quality of life report really came out of, those sort of internal discussions around the need for us to really understand how our clients are performing as it relates to areas such as food security, dietary diversity, asset accumulation, soil health, and land preservation. What's been really exciting about this is that, it's really allowed us, again, as a program to begin thinking about our activities, our program design, and what actions we can take to move the needle across all of these areas. And this particular document, especially if you look at the food insecurity and dietary diversity, when we started, that section was not as comprehensive or as broad as it currently is. It was really limited to the FANTA metric. And then we were working with a partner who was very interested in understanding not only food insecurity, but also nutrition for young children in households. And so that really resonated with us. That is something that we care about. We understand that we serve farming households, and we understand the critical role the nutrition plays in, the children's long-term outcomes and well-being. And so we completely reshaped that section to capture those metrics, and we now collect annual data on that allow us to report on food insecurity and also dietary diversity for children under the age of 3. Moving on to the next slide, again, still with the quality of life report. Acid accumulation is a critical area for us. We know that farming households are particularly subject to shocks, and so we want to make sure that our financial impact, the impact we're saying that they're deriving, is actually being reinvested in bolstering sort of asset holding within the household, so that they are better able to withstand shocks. We know that within the rural sector, with climate change, one season can really knock a household down. And so it's critical that they are building that base. Soil health is another metric. We speak about soil health as like long-term returns. Our programming, if engaging in our programming is leading to is having a detrimental effect on our farmers' soil, that's something that we do want to pick up. We have a do no harm policy, and so if we detect that the soil health of our clients is poorer than that of comparison, a country is then charged to, again, introduce programming or think about how they need to tweak activities to change the course of that. And then lastly, when it comes to land conservation, Phil spoke about how, we see with multiple years of engagement with the programming that clients start to cultivate more and more land. We want to make sure that they are not, moving into indigenous or non-indigenous forests or protected areas. And so we also track that, right? And again, it really speaks to our do no harm policy. We think our programming is powerful. We believe that it is impactful, but we want to be sensitive and careful about it having adverse effects that that are misaligned with our values as a program. Finally, moving on to our newest report, which is our climate and resilience report. We have very big and ambitious impact goals as an organization and at country level. And so each country is in the process. Some of them have finalized it, but are in the process of developing impact strategy that speaks to these 4 pillars: plant health, soil health, diversity, and safety nets. And so we've developed a report that allows each program to track their performance along each of these pillars. So we've identified some key outcomes, and so we track their performance year on year, but also we track, the performance in terms of trends over the last 3 years, last 5 years. And it really works as a bit of a feedback loop where we capture, their outcomes, but we also have a different tab which captures their programming for each of these pillars in terms of the scale. So how many clients are being reached by the specific programming, and also the depth of that programming, right? Because we know that you can have programming, but it's not substantial enough in depth to really move the needle on some of these metrics. And so we really put those 2 sort of like dashboards next to each other. And as we look at how our program is performing, we're also able to provide them with feedback and guidance on the changes that could, again, potentially make in terms of programming to see more meaningful change in their outcomes. And so, when it comes to our reports, like on the whole, especially when it comes to sort of like partners, I think just internally, we've been a little bit of, what do they call it? Not the forefront, but ahead of maybe most of our partners in terms of the things that we care about. And so we've been able to sort of develop our business development team have been able to really go out and sort of share these metrics that we're already collecting data on and fundraise along that. And so we don't often face a situation where we are having to collect a whole new tranche of data for a particular partner. We've been lucky that there's been quite there's been alignment, like a natural alignment. But in cases where, a particular partner wants particular data points, that is something that we do integrate in our reports, and we always try to make sure that we're not just collecting that data for that partner, that we try to integrate it so that our leadership teams are also learning from these particular metrics. And then finally, moving on to our last two slides, thinking about innovations in our reporting and some of the work that WAFA is currently doing. We are really looking on how we're digging into how to disaggregate our data better for particular groups, so young people, youth, and gender. And so with gender, we're looking into sort of man-led and woman-led households versus jointly led households. We really try to categorize households in this way, and then we pull out our reports as per those categories. And we do the same for young people versus not. And this again really helps us to understand, are we serving what you would deem marginalized groups? How equitable is our programming? And again, how do we need to recalibrate our programming, our design, so as to be more equitable? And then when it comes to disobeying our impact by gender, again, this is a new area for us. It has been quite tricky, but WAFA's really led the charge, and I believe that by the end of this year, we're going to have an incredible report that really captures this across the majority of our markets. We have, piloted surveys. It's again because it's such a challenging, such a complex topic. We've piloted surveys in different markets. We've tweaked them. We've adapted them. Our reports are also quite adapted to each country. And so again, we really hope that by the end of this year, we're going to be able to really speak to these key areas. That's it from my side. I'm open to any questions. Thank you, Munib.
Thanks, Dave. Again, a few questions spotting in. While we address those questions, Vafa, is it possible for you to move to that slide in which we were showing the resilience pillars? Because I think some of them would be related to, to the resilience pillars in Eve's. Okay, yeah, this works. So I think when we're talking about resilience here, from my understanding, it's a combination of all these measurements that you do. So the quality of life, the assets, the soil health, the productivity, all comes together. There's a scoring that goes behind it. I think one question before I address from my end, before I ask some of the ones that are coming in the chat, is how do you determine what's good enough from a scoring perspective? Like, how do you set those targets? So there can be a target on a year-on-year basis, but then how is that really determined to address, like, if all of these factors come in together, what is that score that you're working towards?
Yeah, that's a good question. There isn't a composite score. It really is, at th these sort of thematic levels.
Mhm.
In terms of how we deem, our performance, currently we are comparing our performance to comparison farmers. So this is similar to the approach that Phil shared with financial impact. We want to make sure that our clients are outperforming these sort of comparable non-clients. However, what we're potentially shifting to, and I think it's the right thing because oftentimes we are outperforming One Acre Fund clients, is actually setting targets, like targets for each metric that we expect each country to meet. So that would be an absolute target or share. And from our perspective, we think it's critical to have those two layers for comparison because, like as I said, oftentimes our clients are outperforming non-One Acre Fund clients, but we know that that's still insufficient. Like we still don't think that's a good enough threshold for performance. And so we're in the process right now of establishing these more like absolute thresholds for performance. And that's what every country will be sort of marked towards, both how far they are from that and also like how, their growth towards that, their progress towards that.
And is that something that you determine early on before you start your interventions? Like, is there like sort of like an early inception phase sort of planning for this vision, or is that something that you also change over time?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think because, I guess at One Acre Fund, our programming is continuous, right? Like, of course, we layer on like particular interventions, but our programming, the core of our programming is quite like set.
Mhm.
We have like historical sort of baseline data, of course, to look at. But I wouldn't say that I think when I think about sort of like the impact strategy and the conversations that are happening with our impact leads across the different markets, it does seem to me that the the conversations around how to set the target is very much centered on sort of like our, especially when it comes to sort of plant health and soil health, we have internal sort of like agronomists and experts, and they're, I think, through sort of like literature reviews or I guess industry standards, there's certain thresholds that are deemed as good or sufficient. And so that's how those sort of those metrics will be set, as opposed to it being based on any sort of like baseline understanding of our impact on those dimensions, if that makes sense.
Right.
I don't know if that.
No, that helpful. I'm gonna ask a few questions that have been coming in. I'll start with Nabanita's question here. She's from the DCD secretary, so I have to take this. So there's a question on. She says like when she was looking at the figure on asset accumulation, there was a figure on total assets accumulated over time. I think the question is again on causality. Like, how do you attribute how much of that is through your work, or this could be because of external factors as well. So, in a way, what we're saying is if people are building assets through other external factors or other programs or even other situations in which they are able to do it, which is building their resilience, how are you able to separate that out?
Yeah, I would say that when it comes to our financial impact, we definitely are, in terms of our measurement frame, like our measurement strategy and reporting, we are speaking about causality. However, when it comes to these other reports, especially around the holistic impact, we're not designing studies that are intended um, to identify, yeah, to speak to causality. It's really, I don't say directional in nature, but it's about really sort of understanding our clients' performance in comparison to a comparable group. We're not really trying to sort of like separate out our impact. It's more about, are we performing, our clients doing better than our comparison. Maybe Phil, could you speak a little bit about the difference there?
So yeah, I think um, that like as you sort of said, we try our best to get close to causality on all of the indicators. A lot of the times we're relying on that propensity score match. Other times it's on RCTs, but yeah, like the annual stuff is propensity score. Sorry, Eve, was that what you were looking for me to? Great.
Confirm.
Yeah,
Okay. I think
but
another.
primarily, yeah, it's reliance on propensity score match is the main way we're trying to get a causality here.
Right. Okay. So even when it comes to assets and other factors. Okay. I think another question was like when you're really looking at when you said like you're fairly new to addressing all resilience needs to farmers, you said like every country is operationalizing it. Um, but when you say in terms of meeting 100% of farmer resilience or trying to meet as much of farmer resilience as possible, do you specifically only look at agricultural or livelihood shocks or stresses, or more generally, would you also support access to health insurance? Because I think there's a reference to the USAID's resilience research that showed repeated health shocks were the number one thing that pushed households back into poverty over time. So it may not be directly related to One Acre Fund's business, but it is indirectly impacting farmer performance. So is that something that you look into, or is that something that you are cautious of?
Is he frozen? Maybe
I think
I
Eve
think Eve
is.
is frozen. So
So
I'm happy to grab that question. Definitely, it's something that we track. So we know the percentage of our clients and control group who have health insurance, for example. The big one in Rwanda, everybody has like through government health insurance, so you don't see any difference there. I think there's a definite ongoing discussion within One Acre Fund in terms of like how far do we want to go outside of sort of our core mandate. You're absolutely right. Like health insurance would be particularly important for a lot of our clients. Whether we would be the best ones to provide it is, yeah, so sort of like that's where it gets tougher. But definitely, we've been moving more into like crop insurance, for example. So insuring people against uh, drought or other adverse weather conditions.
Yeah, sorry about that. I got kicked off my Wi-Fi. And in some of our markets, we do offer health insurance. In some of our markets, I know, for example, in Kenya, that is offered to clients. And also there's insurance for like if, you know, like a fatality, because we know that health shocks are huge. Yeah, they're huge. They impact our household quite adversely. But these are products that our farmers opt into, right? Like it's not like historically, especially the health insurance for the core channel, it was bundled in that with the input. But that we receive feedback from clients that, that's not something that they want to be bundled and that they would want to opt into it. And so we always say farmers come first. So we did debundle that. And so farmers can opt into that as opposed to, yeah, farmers can opt into those other sort of insurance products.
Right. I think as we're also coming to a close to the webinar, I think what's quite interesting is all these things that you're sharing. It would be super helpful if we could also share some of the resources that you might have, some case studies, examples of where you have done it and your experience. I think specifically this one, when you say that initially you had it bundled, but then based on feedback, you decided to debundle it. How has been the uptake now? How has been the performance of farmers then, like the ones who opt in for specific types of inputs? I think that is quite useful learning because One Acre Fund is in a position in which they have been working in the same space for a while now, whereas programs have limited time to implement and see change. I think some of the people here participating from the program side are working with shorter time frames with not as much room for experimentation. So they need to make
Mm.
quick adjustments, quick. So I think any learnings that One Acre Fund could share. So I think one on developing your scoring matrix, I think that is useful. Maybe an understanding of how much time it takes to get there. Are there good practices now that people can quickly adopt to make those changes? So I think that would be super useful. But any other case studies, especially on adjustments made, that I think for the broader practitioner community is something that people are looking forward to. Because I think we saw a lot of questions on how do you measure empowerment? How do you internalize empowerment in your scoring? I think we see a lot of frameworks for empowerment, but then how do you use them in practice
Mhm.
outside of just reporting? That
Mhm.
is missing. So I think if One Acre Fund has experience, like you're saying, suggesting that, that would be useful as well. There was a question on whether you also disaggregate based on disability when it comes to inclusion. Is that something that you look into?
That's a really great question. Um, Honestly, historically, that was not a metric that we collected. That was not the data point that we collected, but we have started to collect that, both in our administrative data sets, but also in some of our MEL studies. And so it would be possible to do that for sure. I think maybe what's tricky, not tricky, but I think it's just to be really cognizant of the fact that um, the incidence of that within our markets, we found it to be extremely low. And so whether, the output that would be able to derive would be, I don't say useful, but just like from a sort of reporting perspective, whether we'd have sufficient observations, that would be a different story. But yes, it's a new metric that we've started collecting and we'll begin reporting on from this year onwards. Yes, in all of our markets.
Okay, thanks. With that, we're just a minute over time, but I will thank everyone for their time for participating, especially to our presenters for taking the time out and walking us through the One Acre Fund journey. Just a quick note that we will be sending a feedback form, but within that feedback form, we will also share potential links or potential resources from One Acre Fund that might be relevant to this webinar as well. Plus, we will drop a link in which you could sign up to their newsletters to hear more about their work. And again, thank you so much, Wafa, Tim, Philip, Eve, for your time. Thank you for all the questions that you've been asking to the participants. This has been super helpful. Again, thank you.